recent Turkish election, which has influenced the political life in Turkey so much. Have you found it more difficult to speak to Turkey on issues such as combating terrorism during this meeting, and what will happen to the joint energy projects now? Well, no, I didn't have any trouble talking to the Turkish president. I would say, on the contrary, I probably could say there's been a rapprochement. Our positions have grown closer. The Turkish president is a very straightforward and open person. He's not a simple negotiator, he's not a simple counterpart in negotiation, but he also obviously is interested in finding a solution. And yesterday we spent a lot of time discussing both our bilateral relations and the issue of of a solution for Syria, and I think we have managed to find some common grounds based on which we could look for a common solution. The Turkish president told me outright yesterday that he believes the Syrian crisis can only be resolved through political means, and we need to provide an environment for a political process. As for our bilateral projects with Turkey, I see no problems here at all. We will continue working together just the same way as we used to, as we have worked to this date. There are issues in themselves related to trade, but there are always these issues of priority. What comes first? Should the legal procedures for the South Stream come before discounts on gas prices, or vice versa? In any case, Turkey is interested. We have been told that Turkey is interested in preserving and increasing the volume of sales of Russian goods in the Turkish market. Of course, primarily we speak of our gas contracts in the first place. We've considered various ways and scenarios for resolving those issues where we have mutual interest. Izvestia newspaper. I would like to go back to the issue of Ukraine, especially since you had a meeting with Chancellor Merkel, and Germany is one of the Normandy Group states. Do you have concerns that while the international community is focused on combating terrorism, the conflict in Donbass can flare up once again? Well, we depart from the premise that everybody, all the stakeholders involved, will show enough reserve and self-restraint, and we will not see an aggravation of the situation in eastern Ukraine. On the contrary, we're hoping to see that this ceasefire that has taken so many efforts to actually launch, that it will not be violated, but on the contrary, it will enable further political process, a further settlement. As for our deliberations on the developments in Ukraine with my German colleague, there's nothing surprising here. Following the terrible terrorist attacks in Paris, and of course the still unclear tragedy of the Russian jet, of course we primarily discussed those, but the Ukrainian issue also was never off the table, was never off the agenda. I discussed those issues with all the counterparts with whom we had bilateral meetings, so this issue definitely was not off the table. Associated Press. Mr. Putin, you could often hear that your Western counterparts blamed Russia, that Russian air forces were delivering airstrikes on targets in Syria that were not ISIS, that were rather moderate opposition groups. Has that changed in your most recent meetings with them? And my second question, the US-led operation against ISIS has failed to destroy this terrorist group. What is the difference that you see between the actions of the US-led coalition and Russia's aerial operation in Syria? Your first question was whether you felt a difference in attitude as regards Russia's actions in Syria from your Western counterparts. Well, this criticism was almost not voiced this time around. And indeed, it would be difficult to criticize Russia when people tell us, you struck the wrong targets in Syria, and we tell them, well, what are the right targets? Just name them, point us to them. If you believe we are hitting the wrong targets, tell us what targets you believe are wrong. There's no feedback on either of those questions. So how should we take this kind of criticism? Now, I don't want to be too sarcastic about it, but of course there are reasons for this kind of attitude, and one of them is that they are afraid to designate territories for us that we shouldn't hit, because out of fear that we will deceive them all and will specifically deliver airstrikes on those no-go areas. I think here they judge about us based on their own ideas of decency and righteousness. But I can confirm to you that here on the battlefield, in the field in Syria, we have established contacts with certain fractions within the armed Syrian opposition, the so-called diehard Syrian opposition, with parts of it who have requested us not to strike on some of the territories, some of the areas that they control, and we have delivered on those commitments. Now, part of the Syrian opposition believes it possible to start active military engagement against some of the terrorist groups, primarily ISIS, provided our air support, and we are ready to provide that air support to them. If that happens, that would mean that President Assad's troops on the one hand and the Syrian opposition on the other hand are waging war on a common foe. It seems to us that would be a very helpful basis for further activities aimed at achieving a political settlement in Syria. Actually, as a matter of fact, during my recent meeting in Paris within the Normandy format, that was a proposal tabled by the French President, Mr. Hollande. We actually have made our first steps in this direction. They have been positive so far. We really need support from the US, European nations, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, in order for this process to become irreversible. And that is what we were discussing in much detail with my colleagues today. Argumenty Fakty newspaper. Ever since the Russian jet over Egypt crashed, it's been quite a bit of time. There are still complications remaining that you've spoken about, but when should we expect a final conclusion on the causes of that crash? And my second question is, how great do you believe today the risk of Russian cities suffering the same fate as Paris, suffering similar terrorist attacks? What is being done to prevent this kind of attacks from happening? Unfortunately, no one is totally secured against terrorist attacks in their own country. France used to be considered one of the nations that used to be very hard on President Assad personally. We kept hearing it from our French counterparts that Mr. Assad's resignation would have to be a precondition for launching a political process in Syria. Well, has that kind of attitude secured, protected Paris from a terrorist attack? No. I believe that we should not put forth and press forth issues that really are secondary. The first thing we need to do, primarily what we need to do, is join forces in combating terrorist groups. And on that basis, we need to discuss and agree on further political reforms and a political process. As for the crash of the Russian jet, that is a great tragedy for the entire Russian people. Whatever the cause of the crash, there were a lot of casualties, a lot of victims. This is a great tragedy. Yes, we are aware of all the hypothesis of all the scenarios. We're looking at all of them, but we would be able to make a final conclusion after all the tests have been accomplished. What tests are we talking about? If it had been an explosion, that there must be traces of an explosive on the parts of the hull, the equipment, the clothes of the passengers, and we have world-class experts capable of tracking down and detecting those traces. Only following this kind of tests would it be possible to speak definitively about the causes of that crash. As for whether Western nations were efficient in their activities against ISIS, I think this is not the right time for us to try to evaluate and speculate who is being efficient in fighting and who isn't. French jets have now started making sorties more often than they used to, but if you compare them with the intensity of Russia's air forces in Syria, you would get the picture yourself. But like I said, now is not the time to judge who is doing better, who is more efficient, and to try to figure out why the previous military action against ISIS has been less than successful. Now is the time to join forces against a common foe. Thank you.